Please join me welcome Mr. Brad Denig, Managing Director, Innovation for Sustainability at AWR Lloyd, who will introduce net zero and help us clarify net zero target. Welcome.
Thank you, Kun Natnisha, and a great privilege to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. So as mentioned, Brad Denig, Managing Director of Innovation for Sustainability at AWR Lloyd. Our presentation today will be on corporate commitments to decarbonization. We'll focus on what are some of the good practices and some of the practices to avoid when establishing and meeting a net zero target. First thing first, though, is despite the preoccupation with the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis continues and accelerates. So we've seen record-breaking temperatures in the Pacific Northwest that have led to a couple of hundred deaths recently. We continue to see increasing flooding, sea level rise, and wildfires. Just last year, we had $260 billion in estimated economic losses from natural disasters. Those are often exacerbated by climate change impacts. And this is not going to let up. Estimates are for 14% reduction in global GDP by 2050, and an estimated 250,000 global deaths per year between 2030 and 2050 from climate change. Because of this, there needs to be an all hands on deck approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to net zero. So what are net zero emissions? They are defined by IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as when anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, so human caused, are balanced by anthropogenic removals over a specific period. Now, certainly in this decade, we are completely out of balance, but by 2050 is when this needs to be in balance to align with the Paris Agreement in 1.5 degrees. So there is some good news in that corporate commitment to decarbonization is on the rise. So if we look at just the Fortune 500, back in 2016, only 6% had a commitment that aligned with the Paris Agreement. Now, when we compare that to end of year last year, that has increased 5.5 times to 33%. Of that 33%, 56% are carbon neutral or net zero, 45% science-based target, and 35% RE100. When we look at Thailand, so the 100 largest publicly listed companies on the stock exchange of Thailand, we found that 6 out of 100 have a net zero target. 2 out of those 6 address scope 3 emissions in their net zero target. 2 out of 6 also have a net zero target by 2030, and 4 out of 6 have absolute based reduction targets. However, there is some bad news in that the overall reviews for corporate commitments to decarbonization are not entirely great. So if we look at Dr. Jonathan Foley from the influential Project Drawdown, he had mentioned that sadly the net zero concept has been misused by bad or indifferent actors, allowing them to make bold sounding climate pledges without really reducing emissions at all. Some of those reviews focus on the fact that many companies are pushing their net zero target to 2050 or beyond with no interim targets in 2030, 2040, or they are relying too much on carbon offsetting and not taking enough drastic action this decade to reduce emissions. So in order to avoid that kind of bad publicity and to be misaligned with what's really needed, there's a few questions that should be addressed in your net zero target. So first is what is included. So it should address scope 1 and 2 and 3, which is the most difficult because it is not in companies' control and is often very large. As well, all material greenhouse gases. So not just CO2, but if relevant, then also methane, nitrous oxide, and other greenhouse gases. Secondly is when will it be achieved? There's great urgency, so it requires net zero no later than 2050. And as mentioned, it's very important to have short and medium interim targets. The third component is how will it be achieved? So are you transparent with the roadmap of how you're going to achieve emission reductions? Is there a role for your company in carbon offsets, but to what extent do you use them and do you over-rely on them? So those are the 3 key questions. The concern right now and the fear is that there's urgent action required, yet many corporate net zero targets, they don't provide detail, they don't have interim targets, and they rely too much on carbon offsets. So let's quickly do a crash course on issue number one, what is included? So this is a overview of greenhouse gas accounting. So the first thing is, what are the different greenhouse gases? And the first three make up the vast majority of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that are human caused, from CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. The next thing is to focus on scope 1 emissions. This is emissions that companies, they're direct emissions and that they often have the most control over. The most common are stationary and mobile, but often, depending on the industry, both process emissions and fugitive emissions can be significant. The second is scope 2 emissions. So this is all of the electricity, steam, heating, cooling that you are using, but it's generated at a power plant and you're connected through the grid. Many net zero targets rightfully focus on scope 1 and 2 because they can have immediate control or influence over those emissions. However, the big story here is scope 3 emissions. They're difficult to quantify, but they are typically larger than scope 1 and 2 combined, often by a factor of 6 or greater, and they include both upstream and downstream. Now there's 15 categories, but we're just showing a few of them here. The most important in upstream is purchased goods and services in aggregate. It depends by company, but roughly 45% of all scope 3 emissions are purchased goods and services, according to a study by CDP. When we look at downstream emissions, processing of sold products can be significant, but often the largest is use of sold products, and that as well is roughly 45% of total scope 3 emissions. So again, we're looking at scope 3 because they're the largest source of emissions, but they're a source of great market opportunity and as well as risk. So here you're seeing that use of sold products, right? The dark red is your downstream, and then purchased goods and services upstream. According to a study by CDP, that's roughly 90% of all scope 3 emissions, those two categories. So if we look at this by industry, if we're looking at coal mining, right? Coal mining, its emissions will be downstream. Selling a ton of coal to a power plant, that becomes that power plant scope 1 emissions, but is the coal miner's scope 3 emissions. So that's very significant. And that 94% in the middle means that scope 3 emissions in aggregate are 94% of that industry's total scope 1, 2, and 3. This is according to we've looked at the 3 largest companies per sector, and so that's a proxy number for total emissions. Auto industry, again, there's a lot of emissions associated with manufacture of products, but the majority of emissions are downstream in the use phase of those automobiles. It changes as you go into different sectors. Consumer durables is more broad, and then food processing, the majority of its emissions are upstream in the purchased goods and services. We won't go over the other industries, but this presentation will be available to attendees and can review this information later. The next part of what you need in your net zero target is to address when is it going to be achieved. And it's very crucial because right now we are on track for 3 degrees of temperature rise, and we need 7.6% annual reduction in global greenhouse gases this decade, right, to align with a Paris Agreement of holding temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. We've put in here this kind of lifetime icons because one thing that can be frustrating in communicating to folks about climate change is they tend to put off 2100 as if it's generations away, but it's really within the lifetime of folks born this decade, and they will see amazing changes of a radical transformation of our economy to one that is truly net zero, and we are sequestering more carbon than we're emitting for the latter half of this century. One thing I will highlight is this dark gray line is called P4 in the IPCC. That is the worst case scenario for us to align with Paris Agreement. It's where we don't really do much over this decade, or not enough. And it ends up creating a scenario where we rely on carbon reductions to the tune of 20 gigatons per year by the end of this century. That would require 700 million hectares of land, Australia, to somehow magically be found to grow bioenergy crops for bioenergy carbon capture sequestration. So not an ideal scenario. The third part of a net zero target is how will you reduce emissions? So here's illustrative good practice. You're a company that last year had 35 million tons of scope 3, 8 million tons of scope 1, and 4 million tons of scope 2. You want to set a net zero target in 2050. The most essential thing to do is to develop plans with interim targets for how you will reduce scope 1 and 2 is perhaps where you can have the most influence, as well as address your scope 3 emissions. Over time, you can also use carbon removals or offsets, the gray boxes there, where then you can achieve net zero. Some companies will even go beyond that to have more carbon sequestration or removals than they emit so that they become carbon positive. In addition, you need a roadmap and actions, and that should include clear detail for scope 1, 2, and 3, how you will achieve your emission reductions. This is very high level for this purpose, but a good company practice will provide a lot of detail and transparency of what initiatives you're relying on to reduce emissions. On offsetting and removals, you should have a clear strategy as well as focus on SDG co-benefits. In addition, you need awareness and disclosure. So carbon metrics, and perhaps the most important one is what's the carbon intensity per dollar of CapEx. That will tell you your future, right? It won't tell you so much how you produce this carbon intensity in this year or the previous year, but it tells you if you are making investments that are on track with a 1.5 degree scenario. Also important to have carbon pricing, internal carbon pricing, and scenario analysis, ideally using TCFD framework. The very last part is what's your investment and innovation strategy? Do you have a corporate venture capital unit that's focused on the need to decarbonize? Is your M&A strategy aligned with the need to decarbonize? What new business units, products and services and partnerships are you using as well to achieve that? Staying on the innovation theme, a quote from Tim Cook, CEO of Apple: "If you're an executive who has not developed a strategy to address your impact on the climate, then you are failing in your duties as a leader." Agree. And so we've provided an example here of scope 3 emissions opportunities and targets for Ford. So this is for Ford, they have emissions primarily from the company's use of sold products. Their opportunity is electric vehicles, and they've established a target to reduce scope 3 emissions 50% by investing $22 billion to engineer and introduce EVs. Glencore has scope 3 emissions as well from the use of sold products such as thermal coal. Their primary opportunity is clean tech metals, copper being one that will thrive in a decarbonization scenario. So 35% reduction in scope 3 by 2035 for them. Part of that is through depleting of oil and coal reserves, but much of it is through the investment into copper, cobalt, and nickel. All are needed for batteries and renewables. And then lastly, we have an example from Kellogg's. Their scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions have a lot of methane, and this is their upstream emissions. Their opportunity is plant proteins, and to reduce scope 3 50% by 2050 and 20% by 2030. So all of this is to suggest that when you're looking at scope 3, which is why your net zero target should at least address it, is that it can be a proxy for market opportunity, and it requires that reorientation of company strategy to one that very leans in on climate. Our last point here is what's the appropriate use of offsets? So offsetting, especially nature-based solutions, are getting a lot of traction right now, and for good reason. They can get us about 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas reductions we need this decade at an affordable option as well. The things that we would suggest are that these nature-based solutions should not just focus on the carbon offsetting that you're getting, but they should, first of all, they should just be a part of your strategy, not the core of your strategy. The second part is they should really look to leverage commitments to sustainable development goals, circular economy, regenerative business, biocircular economy, et cetera. When done well, investments into nature provide far more benefits than simply carbon removals and sequestration. So our last slide here is, how do we work with companies through our innovation for sustainability practice to achieve net zero? So we started with three key questions, right, for your net zero. What is included, scope 1, 2, and 3, and doing the accounting for that? Not necessarily where we focus, but on when will it be achieved and how will it be achieved, the strategy, that's what our services are intended for. So on the one hand, it's commercial due diligence, so techno-economic feasibility studies of low carbon technologies and business models, strategy and communications, so developing corporate strategy to align with rapid decarbonization, and then providing corporate communications. And then M&A and venture development, so we support B teams on accelerating their decarbonization plans through financial advisory, and then support strategy and innovation teams with co-developing ventures and or developing CVC units. For example, we've been engaged for a number of years on natural capital and have helped co-develop a business that's ready to support companies on nature-based solutions. Core areas of focus for us include EVs, natural capital, energy metals, renewables, and microgrids. Thank you, and also really want to thank all of the team that contributed to this presentation. So thanks very much, and look forward to the other speakers. Thank you.